CVTs, the Rover CVT step speed, steptronic, whatever you want to call it. It is not a very well liked gearbox in the Rover world. Many people will tell you to stay well clear of these gearboxes for many different reasons, and many of these have failed for one or two different reasons. So is there basis on this? Possibly, but let's just take a look at this gearbox and then have a look at the history of CVTs to see whether in perspective it's actually not as bad as what was first made out. Let's get some exact perspective on this gearbox. This is a ZF VT1 32A. There were variations made. I think the mini one was a ZF VT1 27A. There were many variations of this gearbox, but the only real variations was in the actual valve block itself. The actual gearbox is almost exactly the same for a different few manufacturers, which you're going to cover in a second. The story with this gearbox starts in 1992 when Rover actually sourced this gearbox from ZF for the Rover Metro. Now, Rover obviously wanting to test out the actual ability of a CVT, because they didn't have an automatic gearbox of their own. They were at the time relying on Honda to produce the 4-speed Honda-matics that could only be linked to a Honda D series or the Honda H series. They couldn't actually manufacture or at least have a co-partner to make a gearbox that would be fitted to a K series engine. So they seeked a partnership with ZF having this gearbox on the shelf. Now, ZF did not manufacture this gearbox. They merely had it on the shelf from another company, of which I will go into some detail in a second. But Rover put it in the Metro in the 1.4 litre version, and it was a rough and ready car. It was very much a technology at its very genesis and gestation, and many people didn't really take to it. It was only sold in very low numbers throughout Rover Metro and Rover 100 production. People didn't really take to the drony and the whiny sound and the pitch of the engine having no relation to the speed of the car whatsoever that you would normally get in a traditional torque converter automatic or manual gearbox. They then rolled the gearbox out to the Rover R3 216 in the actual K series. The Rover R8 had it with the Tourer, the Coupe and the Cabriolet very late on after 1995, when those cars were virtually on the run out. But they did trial the CVT with the 1.6K series in all them cars, and then they tried it out in the Rover 400 HHR towards the end of that car's life, and then virtually it changed a little bit after that. When BMW came into the fold, they brought the name Steptronic. That was their name. And they basically said to Rover, look, this gearbox, it's got good potential, but we need to make it even better. How can we do that? And Rover came up with giving this actual gearbox computer electronic software via the MEMS3, which controls this gearbox. By the way, it doesn't have a separate gearbox controller. It has an interface unit, which is basically a partner to the ECU itself, but it cannot make decisions. It is the ECU that makes the decision. Rover came up with the computer software in order to actually make this gearbox a little bit more refined, a little bit more economical and powerful, using a stepper motor to actually control the gearbox, the same sort of stepper motor that you have to control the idle valve control. It is simply a motor that works in absolute minute steps, almost 300-400 steps, and it minutely controls the hydraulic pressure going to the actual steel belt pulley itself. Hence, from around 2000 in the Rover 25 and 45, it was known as the Rover CVT Steptronic. It may have been a name on some of their spec sheets, but that's what it was referred to. After BMW had obviously left Rover for basically ditched the company, the Steptronic name had to go with BMW, therefore Rover had to change the name again, and they changed it to Rover Stepspeed. But there is actually no physical difference between these two gearboxes. The same gearbox was also fitted to the MG ZR, remarkably, which is possibly how much Rover actually thought this gearbox was actually quite a sporty gearbox, and from what I've actually experienced, that is actually quite true. They even fitted it to models like the MGF, the MGTF. They all got the actual CVT version on the 1.8 litre versions. The Rover 25 had the 1.6 litre version after 2002. If you bought a Rover 25 1.8 CVT, that is a very rare category indeed, because they only manufactured that for about a year or two. But from around 2002, every single CVT was known as the Stepspeed, but there is literally no difference between the two. The ZS got this gearbox as well, but again, very rare numbers, because many people would not consider a sports car to have an automatic gearbox, or rather they wouldn't consider the gearbox to be a sporty enough drive for such a sporty badge. But actually, for all those people that actually own an MG ZR or ZS or a MGF, MGTF with a Stepspeed automatic transmission or a Steptronic, they will probably tell you how fun it is to drive, especially in the MGF models where you have flappy panels to actually control the gearbox with 6 individual ratios. And for those of you who actually ask, how on earth is that possible? Because the whole principle of a CVT is millions and millions of different ratios. It's a continuously variable transmission. Well, basically, because of the electronic software that the Steptronics have from the 2000 model year, because of the ECU control, they were able to program the stepper motor and the ECU to give 6 individual ratios, effectively a semi-automatic gearbox, as BMW or Porsche would say, a Tiptronic. And let me tell you, it works extremely well indeed. It actually is extremely responsive, and it's actually really fun to drive along the A and B roads. So actually, all in all, a really nice gearbox, but it does take getting used to if you are used to a manual gearbox or a torque converter automatic. The characteristics are not, they're very, very different to what you would normally be used to. I mean, this was such a good gearbox that BMW decided to use this exact gearbox from ZF for the actual Mini R50, R53 up until about 2006. And they had very next to no issues. Obviously, main issues is because people don't change the oil. You have to change the oil every 2 years on these gearboxes, and many people didn't, because they assumed because it's an automatic, it's fluid for life. Well, there's no such thing anyway, and for these gearboxes that was not correct. You need to change the filter, at least the oil, every 2 years. Getting the filter is a bit difficult these days though, and that is why these gearboxes fail, because the oil isn't changed, or it's changed with the incorrect oil, which is why half the issues of failure, it is not down to the gearbox, it is simply down to user owner error. Sometimes I do believe that these gearboxes have thrown a couple of bearings. The bearings are known to go in these. It is a common fault. But anyway, overall it is a decent gearbox, and quite frankly, most of the people that own a CVT Rover actually love them. But where does this gearbox stand in the grand scheme of things as such when it comes to CVTs? Where does this particular gearbox stand? Well, actually, it's quite an important gearbox, more than you actually might originally have thought. Now, the only way I'm going to take you through the history is by going right back to the beginning in Netherlands. And it was started with a man called Hubert van Dorm. The man set up DAF in the 1920s, the late 1920s, and virtually up to the 1950s, DAF was mainly known as a truck manufacturer, and they produced a lot of all-wheel drive platforms for military vehicles during World War II. Van Dorm's vision was to create a small automatic car. I mean, the only real commercial cars that were available with an automatic transmission were huge saloon cars, and I believe the only one that was commercially available in the 1950s was General Motors' Hydromatic 2-speed. What you have to do is put this in perspective of that time. 2- and 3-speed automatic transmissions that were available at the time, they were just not very good. They used to waste such an amount of power, so only huge engines were available to actually propel these cars down the road. So only big, huge luxury saloon cars were the only viable car to use an automatic transmission. And after many years of hard work, that dream finally came to fruition. This started life in 1958 as the DAF Variomatic. And instead of using cogs, it uses 2 sets of conical pulleys containing centrifugal weights, which is driven by 2 separate rubber belts going to each wheel. The pulleys being controlled by an engine vacuum coming from the inlet manifold. Effectively, as the engine speed increases, the engine driven pulley gets bigger and the driven pulley smaller, therefore increasing the ratio, so the car speeds up in a very linear fashion. Therefore, the gearbox is actually at the peak power band at any given moment, producing very little slip, so great economy, great performance when you compare them to traditional torque converter automatics. It was the first commercially successful CVT transmission, and it was introduced first on the DAF 600 and then other subsequent models afterwards. In the DAF 600, each back wheel was driven by its own drum and belt assembly, so you have 2 sets of pulleys and belts, effectively a transmission per wheel, and no differential. Strangely, this gives the effect of a limited slip differential, so if one wheel starts losing traction and starts slipping, the other wheel can still transfer the full torque over to the other wheel. That gives remarkable handling characteristics, and it's probably the main reason why DAF was so very successful in rallying. They absolutely dominated the Dutch railcross scene in the 1970s with the 55 and the 555s absolutely throughout. Nothing could match them with the engine at constant peak performance at all road conditions. Nothing could compete with it. Believe it or not, a little fun fact actually. Because of the way the Variomatic actually worked, it could go in reverse just as quickly as travelling forwards in drive. And there was also such a thing as the Dutch Backward Driving Championships. Yes, that was actually a thing. And as you can imagine, DAF had to be banned and put in a category of its own simply because it just kept winning. Another weird feature is that the gearbox actually features a centrifugal clutch. Now because of that, the Variomatic actually can't creep. It has no creep facility. And also it's recommended to start the car in gear. Apparently starting the car in cold, in neutral, and then going to a driven gear could result in transmission damage. There were, however, some limitations to this transmission. Namely, because of a lack of a proper differential, the system was a little slow to react from one side to the other under loss of traction, and it caused excessive stress on various components. The main one being excessive belt slipping on cornering, which as you can imagine caused the belt to wear very quickly. It wasn't uncommon as well to hear of snap drive shafts. So they did make a few changes down the line, like adding a differential to the transmission in the DAF 66. This prevented excessive belt wear, so less slippage was occurring overall. Needless to say, there would be teething problems with such a new technology, but it was so commercially successful that DAF had sold over 1 million vehicles with the Variomatic transmission in 20 years. And it didn't even stop there, because Dr. Hubert van Dorm basically opened a new factory around the time he retired in 1965, calling it the Van Dorm Transmission Factory, which still stands today. He later retired, but started work in his garden shed on the 2nd generation Variomatic, using a steel push belt. And in 1974, Volvo bought DAF, but the rights for the Varimatic transmission went straight back to Van Dorn Transmissions as a patent itself. And Van Dorn kept working on his steel pushbelt prototype all the way to his sudden death in 1979. But his work continued with Van Dorn Transmissions. They continued working on this steel pushbelt prototype until it actually became a viable commercial gearbox in 1986 with a joint collaboration between Van Dorn Transmissions, Ford and Fiat. This new second generation CVT transmission, which was designed for front wheel drive applications, uses a steel push belt instead of the earlier rubber belt. It uses an oil pump driven by the engine instead of using vacuum from an engine like before, and it uses an actual planetary gear set which you'd normally find in a torque converter automatic instead of using the old centrifugal clutch. The first adopters of this new CVT gearbox was both Fiat, who introduced it in the Fiat Uno and the Fiat Panda as the Selector model in 1986, and Ford, who put it in the Ford Fiesta 1.1 in 1987, and it was known as the CTX gearbox. This was the start of the CVT gearbox being more widely known in the car domain, and what better way than to use 2 or 3 very popular small cars to showcase this gearbox. However, the problem was, because people were just not used to the characteristics of this gearbox, meaning the engine having a constant pitch going down the road, completely independent of road speed, where it was a little bit drony and groany. People just didn't like it. They didn't buy it in any sheer numbers. It didn't sell very well, and it was considered a bit of a flop early on. And the worst thing was, the car media and testers, they weren't very enthusiastic about this gearbox either. So I can understand why people just didn't really want to buy it, especially as you'd be paying way more because it's an optional extra. However, there was a very brief chapter where this gearbox could have been given so much good coverage that it may have become widely acceptable in the 1990s. And that is Formula One. In 1993, Team Williams was completely dominating the sport. Consecutive Constructors and Drivers' Championship wins with its Renault V10 and semi-automatic gearbox. It was way ahead of the competition. But they thought they could be even further ahead by using the original Varimatic transmission but with steel push belts in order to cope with that 850 brake horsepower from that Renault V10. They ended up designing the car and giving it several trials in Wales, driven by David Coulthard. The trials appeared to be so successful, there were even strong rumours it was in fact a few seconds a lap quicker than their current car. This would have absolutely blown everyone out the water. However, the FIA got wind of this development, and within about 2 weeks they come up with new regulations for the 1994 season, saying that every car must have between 4 and 7 gears, effectively banning that car to the history books. Why? Good question. There were a few good reasons. Mainly, for a spectator sport, hearing the constant whine of an engine without gear changes is a little bit drab and boring and a bit drony. They were also concerned about the competition aspect. Other teams would probably have seen how successful this was and followed suit, but at some considerable expense of development, and this could easily have put some of those teams into administration. And then there's the skill side of things, the skill of driving a semi-automatic gearbox. It still requires an element of skill in changing gear at the right time. That is a driver's skill, whereas a CVT does away with that skill. So I can understand why that would be the case. So any hope of the transmission getting more light of day and general acceptance generally scuppered. Other manufacturers have used CVT since then, including Audi with its Multitronic CVT, launched in 1999 and was engineered by Van Dorn Transmissions, but now known as Bosch since 1995 when they took them over. And it uses a chain instead of a steel belt. And it was fitted to the Audi A4, the A5 and the A6 all the way up to 2014 when it was replaced by the DSG gearbox. And then Toyota came in the act with the KVZT from 2000 and has been around in various guises, and it's still in production today in some of their models. It uses a torque converter to aid the multiplication of torque from a low ratio. How clever is that? Subaru, Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, they have all adopted CVT transmissions over the last 20 years. So clearly they think they're onto something, and they clearly think that it works. But also, Van Dorn Transmissions, now owned by Bosch these days, actually developed their own push belt gearbox for use in the VW Golf E. It was designed in 2021 and it uses the old-fashioned concept of a push belt, but to be used in conjunction with an electric motor. The theory is that a CVT produces its own internal torque, so therefore is very well suited to high torque off-roading duties, meaning that under certain situations you can have a smaller electric motor and therefore smaller battery packs. I mean, for an EV, that is a win-win in a lot of situations. So you may be asking yourself, where does the ZF VT1 gearbox fit in that was fitted to almost every Rover and MG since 1992? Well, this is not a ZF gearbox. This is a gearbox, I will tell you now, that ZF bought off the shelf from, oh yes, VDT. Can you guess what gearbox this is? Because if you haven't guessed now, I'm leading up to this now. This is exactly the same gearbox as fitted to the Ford Fiesta 1.1 and the Fiat Uno Panda Selector. It is literally the gearbox that Van Dorn started working on in his garden shed with the steel push belt system. It is exactly the same gearbox that Van Dorn Transmissions worked on throughout the early 80s and launched in those three particular Super Minis in 1986. ZF had merely bought this gearbox off the shelf and adapted it slightly for Rover's applications. The only difference between all three gearboxes from three different manufacturers is the valve blocks are slightly different. They are adapted for every single car, and that is it. So the ZF VT1 is the second generation CVT. It is the first CVT that was created for front wheel drive cars. So this gearbox is very much in the history of CVT gearboxes. It is a first. So I think on this basis, this gearbox deserves a little bit of sympathy for the slight jerkiness that you may experience at moving off and at low speeds. But apart from that, for a gearbox that dates back to the 80s, this is absolutely superb at what it does. And I think this is an example of how the car buying public have changed their attitudes so much to automatic transmissions. This gearbox was just not accepted. Even in the 90s and noughties, people just didn't like these things. People just saw them as an alternative because maybe they couldn't drive a manual gearbox. And it gave people the ability to drive a small car with an automatic gearbox. CVTs have never really had a reputation for being driven in high-powered applications, but in the Audi Multitronic it has been proven that a strong CVT transmission can be built to hold huge amounts of torque and power. So that rumour is completely out the window. But really honestly, this is an example of how technology that was so advanced for its day that people couldn't accept it and couldn't get on with it. But now as time has gone on and automatic gearboxes have stacked more ratios and more gears, and now we've got 10-speed gearboxes as opposed to the old 3-4 speed automatic gearboxes, with the ratios so close together that you barely feel it. It's a seamless drive. Well, what's that then? That is a seamless drive. So this is what people have wanted for a long time, a CVT gearbox. This is where we've been going for 40, 50, 60 years of automatic transmissions. Don't take my word for it, the facts speak for themselves. And this is a quote from Bosch in 2007. Production has increased sharply in the past years. Less than 10 years ago, the global annual production of CVT systems amounted to 3 million units, whereas in 2017 the annual production is estimated to be 14 million. So what started out as a gearbox that people just didn't understand and just didn't enjoy in any aspect whatsoever has now become a source of hope in the light of EV applications, EV cars, electric vehicles not requiring a gearbox. But it actually might be proven that with the Bosch gearbox in the VW Golf, it may be a successful gearbox going forwards, and it may potentially outlive every single other type of gearbox. Manual gearboxes, traditional torque converter automatics, dual clutch automatics, manuated automatics. It will outlive the lot of them. How good would that be? I'm a massive champion of automatic gearboxes, and I have not experienced a CVT until the last 6 months, and this is one cracking gearbox. The way it drives is so linear and smooth. It is unlike anything else on the roads. I shall leave you with that. Take care, guys.